My name is Wyse. I am the Data and Image Management Consultant at the Flemish Art Collection. I work closely with the Flemish Museum sector to provide solutions for the challenges involved in digitalization, metadata, data, image management, policy, and digital accessibility of cultural heritage in general. Previously, I worked at the Belgian State Archives, where I also provided solutions for the challenges of converting archives that were poorly described or had descriptions in inaccessible formats to formats that were accessible. Today I'm going to talk to you about the work the Flemish Art Collection has been doing to provide digitalized museum collections for public access and public reuse. The Flemish Art Collection has existed since 2006. Initially, it was set up to be a partnership for a number of fine arts museums in Flanders, primarily with the function of coordinating cooperative tasks such as collective acquisition plans, an annual summer course for PhD students, creating online museums to demonstrate some of the thematic collections of these fine arts museums, and also to create a central platform to provide online access to the collection. Since 2019, the Flemish Art Collection has been recognized and subsidized by the Flemish government as a service provider for all Flemish museums. In this role, the Flemish Art Collection receives an annual subsidy to provide services to the Flemish museums for all matters relating to data and image management. Under this role, the Flemish Art Collection still continues its previous tasks of being a cooperative organization for fine arts museums in Flanders. Some of the new tasks include the supporting of museums with the standardization and normalization of their metadata, as well as creating data and image management policies for museums, providing expertise for subsidized projects, and developing the platform that the Flemish Art Collection has developed for aggregation and providing of the museum collections to the public. The Flemish Art Collection works closely with 5 main partners, all dating from the time of the Partnership for Fine Arts Museums. The initial partners were the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp, the Groningen Museum, which is now part of Museum Brugge in Bruges, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Ghent. Later, in 2017, M. Leuven and Wyse, the Museum for Arts at the Sea in Ostend, also joined the Flemish Art Collection as fixed partners. These are not the only museums we work with, of course. We work with any other museum that's interested in our services. Since 2015, the Flemish Art Collection has been developing a metadata and image aggregation infrastructure. This was designed by Matthias van der Maassen in cooperation with PACT, which is now a subdivision of the new organization MIMO, and there are a number of core components to our infrastructure. The collection management system is the metadata source for our infrastructure. The digital asset management system is the image source. The components that we developed ourselves are the Data Hub, the metadata aggregation platform, Image Hub, which is a IIIF manifest aggregation platform, the image server we didn't develop ourselves but have extended, and that provides an implementation of the IIIF image API, and the Art Hub Flanders, which is the presentation platform. These components will be discussed more specifically in the later section. The first part of this talk is about the data and image management in our partner museums. This is the initial step of providing the collections to the public. They have to be well described in metadata, and they have to have a digital representation. The metadata describes the physical objects and the relevant information. The images are the digital representations of physical objects. The Flemish Art Collection's partner museums use 3 collection management systems: AdLib, the Museum System or TMS, and Axial Collections. The Flemish Art Collection itself uses collective access for metadata enrichment. For registration, we internally use 2 specific profiles in the so-called invalboek objecten. Profiles that we use are the minimale registratie, which is essentially the absolute minimum of metadata that should be entered for any object, and the basis registratie, which is a slightly bigger set of very basic metadata. We also require internally that each record has an associated persistent identifier, one for the physical object, which we call the word PID, one for the record, which is called the data PID, and one for the primary digital representation. Even though we have these reference profiles that we use, each museum still has its own policy and needs with registration. A very good example of this are names. The simple case, we'll take James Ensor. It's often registered as Ensor James. Because we are a Flemish organization, we work with Flemish museums, we have a lot of Dutch names that we have to work with. So for example, Jan van Eyck, which if you write the last name first, can either be done with Van Eyck Jan or Eyck Jan van, depending on whether you're not used the Belgian method or the Dutch method. There are of course many names with multiple different spellings and also familial generations. Take for example Bruegel. You have multiple generations in the family, you have multiple different spellings. One of the potential solutions is the use of external authorities, such as Archide Artists or ULAN. A number of the Flemish arts museums use Archide Artists, but even then, museums don't necessarily follow the preferred order of names. And there is also the question of related fields. This image is an extract of Lido metadata after we have aggregated it from 2 of our museums. The preferred term on the name actor set is the one that comes from the registration system itself. You can see here in the 2 examples that one is Enzor James and the other is James Enzor. To get around these problems, we choose a preferred internal name that is given here as the alternate name for the actor set. In both cases, that is James Enzor. This allows better internal consistency and it makes it easier to display to the public as well. This example is with Peter Bruegel II, also called the Younger, and you can see that there are 3 different ways here that this name is registered in the name actor set preferred value. One of our museums has gone with Bruegel Peter de Jonge, one has gone with Peter Bruegel, and the last has gone with Bruegel Peter II. You can see that in the alternate value for the name actor set, we have standardized that internally to Peter Bruegel II. This next slide is an extract from AdLib, from the 3 partner museums using AdLib, and it just shows that even while the name is registered exactly the same in all 3, the extra information surrounding the name and the related fields is different. So how do we handle these differences? We have decided for a policy of internal normalization, but no normalization between museums. While this would be desirable, of course, it's hard to argue that each museum should change how they do their internal registration and essentially re-register thousands of records so that there's consistency with other museums. As such, we handle the intercollection normalization during aggregation. There's also the question of registration for an international audience. All of our museums use only Dutch for registration. So to provide the metadata to a wider international audience, the Flemish Art Collection would very much like to be able to provide English metadata alongside the Dutch metadata, which sounds simple. But in practice, there is a lack of personnel and time in all the museums. And there are also constraints in the registration systems themselves. A lot of registration systems are not made for multilingual registration. The result is that in most of our partners, only the titles are registered multilingual, and even that is not a guarantee. Ultimately, we need to find other solutions. There is also the question of how to store and manage images. Up until now, the most common way is using file servers or hard drives, but there are the problems of duplicates. A lot of copies get made for different purposes. Images can be lost, they can be forgotten about, and it's often very hard to link them to collection metadata or to the physical objects themselves. So to solve some of these problems, the Flemish Art Collection recommends the use of a digital asset management system. We also have found that the use of a digital asset management system has the potential to increase access within the organization to images. Often only one member of staff has access to the hard drive where the images are stored, and everyone who's used the image has to come and ask. The recommended digital asset management system for the Flemish Art Collection is Resource Space. As a free open source digital asset management system, we find that very beneficial. It's allowed us to extend it as needed. To integrate it within our infrastructure, we have developed, along with the Royal Museum for Fine Arts in Antwerp, a tool to automatically populate the relevant metadata fields from the collection registration system via the Data Hub. And Royal Museum of Fine Arts Antwerp has also significantly expanded Resource Space for internal image management. The benefits that we found with Resource Space and the extensions we have is they've significantly reduced the workload for image metadata entry. Also with Resource Space, you can copy the image-specific metadata from the EXIF or IPTC tags within the file. Another problem that we have is copyright and the rights on works. There are two sets of rights that cause problems: copyright and access rights to images. There are 2 different sets of copyright, 2 for each digital reproduction of a physical work. One for the physical work itself, and there's also the copyright on the image itself. The Flemish Art Collection recommends the use of either rights statements or Creative Commons licenses. As for access rights, the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp has developed an access rights tree as part of their improvement of Resource Space for image management. They essentially give 4 potential levels of access to images, either only for internal use, or for internal use and academic use, or for both of those plus use for museums and other institutions, or where an image is free for public use, and therefore also for any of the other levels of that access tree. When coupled with authentication, for example via Active Directory Federation services, which is the case for the Royal Museum of Fine Arts, it provides them. And then the Data Hub, the Image Hub, and the Image Server. Here is a diagram of the data flows within an installation of the Flemish Art Collection's infrastructure. The lines in red are the flow for metadata, the lines in yellow are the flow of IIIF manifests, and the lines in green are the flows of images. The registrars or any other staff who has access to the content management system or the digital asset management system can load metadata. They edit metadata, they add metadata, and the same for images. From the collection management system, the Data Hub extracts that collection metadata and transforms it to Lido XML. And from there, that metadata goes on to further reuse applications. The images are similar. The member of staff adds them to the digital asset management system. From there, in the case of Resource Space, the metadata flows automatically from the Data Hub also into the digital asset management system. From there, IIIF manifests are generated and stored in the Image Hub, and the images are transformed and stored on the image server in the necessary formats. And then those IIIF manifests and the images flow on to further reuse as well. There are currently 4 separate implementations of the Flemish Art Collection's infrastructure. The main one in production is metadata aggregation aggregation without AAAF images. That's the initial setup from 2015 that's still in use. Added onto that is a AAAF infrastructure only for the works of James Ensor. There's also a test implementation of the AAAF infrastructure that is completely separate, and there's no direct connection to content management systems or digital asset management systems. The Royal Museum for Fine Arts in Antwerp has their own implementation for internal image management, which has been developed significantly by them as well to allow for better internal image management. And finally, since this year, the museum has set up an implementation for both internal image management and also content provision to their new website. There is also at this moment a fifth implementation being prepared for the Museum Brugge. This will be initially a test for non-art historical objects. This image shows then essentially duplications of the data flows as they're currently set up between different institutions. So Flemish Art Collection set up there in green, the connections with the Museum of Fine Arts in Ghent and Museum Brugge in grey, and then also the two separate implementations in Museum and the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp. The Flemish Art Collection uses Kathmandu for its extract, transform, load operations. Kathmandu is developed by a consortium of libraries and is designed initially for library use, but has been extended and adapted by the Flemish Art Collection to function for art purposes. A pipeline within Kathmandu can be seen as 5 steps using 3 different types of module and a content-specific file. An item is initially retrieved from a database or other source using a store module. It is then imported with an importer module. It's transformed according to the fixer file, which is content specific. It is then written using an export module and stored using, again, a store module. To work with the Flemish Art Collection's infrastructure and DIDO, the Flemish Art Collection extended Kathmandu, providing modules for the registration systems and components, and also for the various file formats used. All of this was combined into a toolkit as a wrapper around Kathmandu called the Data Hub Factory. The fixer file is written in a domain-specific language designed as part of the Kathmandu project called Fix, and it was designed specifically for manipulation of data items. There is an open question what the future will be for ETL pipelines within the Flemish Art Collection, because Kathmandu is not designed for museum collections, because it is written in a programming language of which no current member of staff or external contractor has experience with, and because of potential changes to the future infrastructure and new connections and collection management systems. It is an open question whether or not we'll be able to continue using Kathmandu or have to find other solutions. For collection management, as said earlier, all of our partner museums use either AdLib, the museum system, or Axial Collections. At this stage, there is no museum using Axial Collections actually connected to the Flemish Art Collection's infrastructure. AdLib is used by 3 of the 5 partner museums, provided by Erfgoed Inzicht, an organization initially set up by a couple of provinces here in Flanders and is now part of the Flemish government. It uses a single SQL database for all of the 120 plus museums that are using AdLib through it. To facilitate this, each museum gets a range of record IDs, and the front end that they have for that museum is limited only to that range. They can't see the metadata from another organization, they can't edit the metadata from another organization. And AdLib through Erfgoed Inzicht is accessed through a Windows remote desktop. The single database does allow access to all the relevant collections for the Flemish Art Collection from the API, but it also has the downside of all fields are the same for all users, so it is very hard to get a customized field for a specific museum where that's needed. The biggest example that we've in the Flemish Art Collection is the persistent identifiers. There are no specific fields in AdLib for this. To facilitate the harvesting of metadata from the AdLib collections, there exists an API using OAI PMH protocol. It's a single configuration for the Flemish Art Collection, but there's also been an extra configuration added for Museum in function of their own implementation for their website and internal image management. The pipeline from AdLib uses the Data Hub Factory and works for all partner museums using AdLib through Erfgoed Inzicht. It is the case that separate fixed files are needed for each museum. Even though the fields are the same, there are differences in registration. In the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp, the museum system is used. There are a few key differences compared to AdLib. It is client-based, not on a remote Windows machine. It's managed by the museum itself, which allows for much easier customization and adding new fields if needed. It also uses a Microsoft SQL database. This is a problem because it is not possible to directly connect our pipelines to the Microsoft SQL database. The collection data first has to be copied to a MySQL database and partially transformed into MySQL views, and from there it's exported to several SQLite databases. These SQLite databases are accessible through our pipelines, and from there the connection is essentially similar to AdLib, transformation to Lido XML and then loading into the Data Hub. Axial Collections at this stage is only used by M11, which is not yet connected to our infrastructure. It is also being considered by Erfgoed Inzicht to replace AdLib. We see there are some benefits compared to AdLib, such as the existence of dedicated fields for persistent identifiers. This is a standard part of Axial Collections. It is also advertised as AAAF compliant, which potentially makes it easier then for providing images in AAAF format, and Axial Collections has also said that export in Lido XML is possible. This would allow us to skip the transform step of our operations load into the data hub. There are, however, some potential problems, such as the existing data hub factory might not be compatible, and existing mappings are likely to be incompatible due to the fields having new names. Resource space is the choice of DAMs for the Flemish Art Collections, as I said earlier. It is open source and it is extensible. With the tool developed, you can import metadata directly from the data hub, which, as said, is a significant time saver for museums using it. It's also been further expanded by the Royal Museum of Fine Arts with authentication using ADFS, so there's no additional login required for staff of the museum. They just log in as normal to the internal network and can access the resource space without a separate login. There are also the access right levels tool to generate tiled pyramidal TIFF files that are required for AAAF, and also the ability to view those pyramidal TIFF files in Mirador and Universal Viewer. The Data Hub is the metadata aggregation component. It's built using the Symfony PHP framework and MongoDB. There is an open question about the suitability of MongoDB in the long term, especially with its new license to server-side public license, which is possibly not compatible with our philosophy of open software. The interaction with the Data Hub occurs through APIs. There is a RESTful API used for the ingest and retrieval of individual records within the infrastructure. It's also used to validate those records against XSD schemas. There is also an OAI PMH endpoint for harvesting of metadata that's publicly accessible. At this stage, the Data Hub only supports Lido XML. Ideally, it will be extended in the future for other metadata standards. The primary candidates that we have at this stage are MARC XML, ERD, and the European Data Model. The Image Hub and Image Server are the AAAF components of the infrastructure. The Image Hub is built similarly to the Data Hub with the Symfony and MongoDB, and it has the same questions around the further use of MongoDB. The Image Hub implements the AAAF Presentation API, which allows images to be displayed in a AAAF viewer, and the manifests also include a subset of relevant collection metadata to display. For the Image Server, the Flemish Art Collection uses Cantaloupe. This is compliant to AAAF Image API 2.1.1. One big benefit of the Cantaloupe Image Server is that it supports authorization policies, which complements authentication in resource space. AAAF manifests are loaded from the Image Hub by the AAAF viewer in the Art Hub, and it is also possible to link from other viewers and other online platforms. The Art Hub was developed as a basic presentation interface for the Data Hub. It's built using Project Blacklight, which is a discovery platform framework built upon Apache Solr. At this stage, we have two separate versions of the Art Hub. A non-AAAF version, which was the initial development for the metadata aggregation, using Mirador Viewer to display images directly from the content management system in a non-AAAF form. And the AAAF version, which at this stage uses Universal Viewer. It is very much possible that that will change in the future as we try and support more aspects of AAAF. There's also the question of the technical implementation into the Art Hub and other platforms. For example, Universal Viewer in its Ruby version, which is required for the Apache Solr, has not been recently updated and is potentially less easy to maintain in the future for us. One of the design considerations of the Art Hub is that it is bilingual, Dutch and English. At this stage, that's of limited application, of course, because the metadata is only monolingual in Dutch. The Art Hub implements filter-based browsing and list and grid-based views, as can be seen here. This is the Dutch version, but as I said, given that the content is monolingual coming directly from the collection management systems, in practice it doesn't make so much difference at this stage. This also gives an example of some of the problems with collection registration. There, in many cases, the same term appears under both, for example, type and subtype, or multiple synonyms of terms appear. This demonstrates the grid-based view that exists in the AAAF Art Hub as well as the filters that exist. To provide our content to the public for further use and reuse, the Flemish Art Collection has an open data policy, and the Flemish Art Collection also supports and encourages the use of linked data and controlled vocabularies. To facilitate the provision of aggregated metadata, the Flemish Art Collection requires museums to release their metadata to us under a CC0 license, that is public domain free for all reuse. We do make an exemption for fields with significant originality, such as description. These we require to be released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial license. The design specification for the Data Hub was that the metadata is provided in an open standard. Lido XML was chosen for this as a standardized form for all aggregated museum collections, independent of the content management system and the registration policy of the museum. A recent development in Flanders is the development of a metadata standard for all cultural heritage institutions. This is part of an initiative from the Flemish government and forms part of a series of similar standards for other uses and applications. In the case of the Cultural Heritage Standard, this is based on CIDOC CRM. So the fact that we already use Lido XML is quite a big benefit because it should hopefully allow much easier conversion to the new metadata standard if that is needed in the future. Images are significantly more complex. Because there are two sets of copyright in each image, both for the physical object and the image itself, it can be quite difficult to release images in such an open way as the metadata. For physical objects that are currently under copyright, the Flemish Art Collection has a contract with the Belgian rights management organisation SABAM, which covers not only the Flemish Art Collection but also its partner museums. This allows for the display of these works that are under copyright in a limited resolution. We also have internally the policy that reproductions of public domain works should be in the public domain themselves. This viewpoint is also codified by the European Union itself in 2019 in its new copyright directive, but this has not yet been implemented in Belgian law, and there still remains the question of what about already existing digital representations that already have copyright applied to them. Will they in the future also be forced to follow the same standard, or will those rights continue to exist? As long as there are still copyrights applicable to these historical digital reproductions, it can very much hinder the ability to provide these to the public in an open manner. At this stage, linked data is not a common part of registration in the Flemish museums. It takes a lot of time, and that's not really a priority use at this stage compared to registering, for example, new objects. And it can also be the case that the support in the collection management software is lacking. The Flemish Art Collection enriches a selection of these metadata fields with linked data in the course of aggregation in the pipeline from the collection management system to the data hub. In 2021, there is the potential for a project around icon class in 4 of the 5 partner museums. This will see icon class codes being registered in the collection management systems themselves, and there is also the potential there to improve the multilingual capabilities of icon class to be not only available in English but also in Dutch. We also see a significant potential for the expansion of linked data use within our partner museums. We also hope that multilingual vocabularies can provide a solution for multilingual metadata. For example, the Arts and Architecture Thesaurus is available both in Dutch and English, as well as a number of other languages. At this stage, the IIIF infrastructure is in its second stage of the subsidized project. There is also the potential for a third phase, depending on the results of the second phase and what further development there is to do. There are also possibilities independent of subsidized projects. Development is always an ongoing process. The second phase of the subsidized project started in October 2020 and will end in September 2021. The goals of this phase are to provide a connection to MIMO digital asset management system. A second goal is the expansion to include so-called hybrid collections. These are collections that consist both of art historical objects as well as other types of objects. This will be done in partnership with the Museum Brugge. There's also a goal to implement layers and annotations, which will be done in partnership with the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp. As I said earlier, there's also the potential for a third subsidized phase. The content of this is as yet undecided, but one possibility is linking all the separate installations that already exist as a semi-distributed IIIF infrastructure. This would allow us to avoid duplicating images, for example, in the Flemish Art Collection for aggregation, to instead link to the image as stored in the IIIF infrastructure of a partner museum. Another possibility is adapting the Flemish Art Collection's existing online museums to use the IIIF infrastructure. There's also the potential to expand to other types of collections.